Thank you, Xavier. And can I just begin by saying I think it's been a great program and you've done a remarkable job in bringing together a set of very new and significant papers. But I'm pleased to introduce Keith Windschuttle, and this will be brief because his extensive activities over so many decades can't easily be summarised. But born in 1942, a BA from Sydney University, an MA from Macquarie, historian, writing first significantly about unemployment in 1979, causes and socialist response. And I think one of the things that people will note about Keith is his ability to shift his position as evidence and material changes. Famously, The Killing of History in 1984, a critique of postmodernism in the study of history. Even more significantly, The Fabrication of Aboriginal History, Van Diemen's Land, and subsequent volumes on the same theme, including The Stolen Generations and whether one believes every point that he's put in these books and these articles or not, he has had an important and iconoclastic role in challenging some of the ideas that have been too easily accepted as orthodoxy. The persecution of George Pell, he formed a press company, Macleay Press, and he's also been editor of Quadrant for a long period, 2007 to 2015, and I think many of the materials introduced during that period were very significant. He has managed to get himself in scraps and disputes with many, and I'm not going to name all of them because there's a very long list, but I'd single out Henry Reynolds and James Boyce and others, but such is the nature of his challenge is that it has got up the nose of many on the left. Today's contribution is truth-telling about Samuel Griffith, and Samuel Griffith is, for us in the society, a person of great merit, not only a Premier of Queensland and a High Court judge, the first, and such a significant part of the constitutional conventions that wrote our Constitution, that he is a person worth defending, a person whose wisdom is embedded in our Constitution. Now, it doesn't mean that everything about an historical figure such as Samuel Griffith is perfect, and there have been attacks in the recent period. I noticed, strangely, a defence by Henry Reynolds of some of the points that were made at some of those early attacks. But there is a very strong movement internationally to tear down any person who has made a significant contribution historically, to tear down any statue, literally and figuratively. And I think that has to be resisted, but I'm very interested to hear today what Keith has got to say. I think he's a person whose views have moved as he's been presented with evidence, and he's done amazing original research. So Keith, we're honoured to have you here. Please speak.
Right, well, thanks for those generous opening remarks. Samuel Griffith, the man who this society and this conference are named after, was one of Australia's great men. We were lucky to have him as the principal author of our Constitution and as our first Chief Justice of the High Court. However, according to one of Australia's most celebrated academic historians, Henry Reynolds, this conference and this society have both been honouring a man unworthy of any respect. He was a man guilty of what Reynolds calls, and I'll quote him, crimes against humanity. Now, I'll explain the conclusion, how he reaches the conclusion of that shortly, but first, let me say that this was not a passing comment, was not something that he said in a pub or in a quick interview with a ABC reporter. It was not a man who's had too much to drink. It's a carefully calculated accusation in the name of Aboriginal truth-telling. And Samuel Griffith has 2 chapters in the book of the same name, Truth-Telling, that Henry Reynolds has written recently. And Reynolds, it should be recognised, the historian, is one of the linchpins of the current intellectual case for rewriting the Constitution. He's been arguing for that for something like 40 or 50 years. The book's front cover has endorsements from our most prominent Aboriginal activists. Marcia Langton says, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people owe much to Henry Reynolds, and Mick Dodson says, this book, Truth-Telling, will allow Australians to build a better, more truthful Australia. Now, ever since the concept of the voice emerged from the Uluru meeting in 2017, its authors have made it clear that changing the Constitution is only the start of what they call their unfinished business. The ultimate goal is sovereignty, that is, exclusive political power over the lands that their forebears, or their imagined forebears, once traversed. And to attain proper retribution for this loss, today's Aboriginal activists insist there are 2 inherent concepts that must be fulfilled: treaty-making and truth-telling. But neither of these concepts has, unfortunately, generated a great deal of public debate. Nonetheless, they are an integral part of the deal for constitutional referendum. And in this paper, I want to deal with what is involved in the issue of truth-telling. Now, Reynolds' book devotes a lot of space to the question of how many Aborigines were killed by white colonists in the frontier wars that supposedly raged across Australia from 1788 to 1928. Reynolds claims the Aborigines suffered a death toll of more than 100,000 warriors. This is a greater total, and this is a political point he makes, this is a greater total than that of the white Australian soldiers killed in all the overseas wars in our subsequent history. Reynolds also devotes several chapters to discussions of the politicians and judges who brought about the Federation of Australia in 1901. He gives extended discussions of 3 of them who were premiers of their respective states in the 1880s and the 1890s. Samuel Griffith in Queensland, John Downer in South Australia, and John Forrest in Western Australia. Now, in this country, we have very few political or legal heroes. Unlike the United States, where founding fathers such as Jefferson, Franklin, Madison, Adams, Hamilton are all household names. But in Australia, it's a pity that we haven't followed the American example there, because when you get to know what our leading political figures achieved in creating our nation in 1901, both the task when they were colonies and the outcome when they formed the nation are pretty impressive. And they deserve the title that the Americans have of founding fathers. However, that's not the view of most of today's left-wing academics and political figures. In the case of the book Truth-Telling, when Reynolds discusses Samuel Griffith, John Downer and Andrew Forrest, their public identity, he holds them all in contempt. Reynolds wants to see their reputations destroyed, their public identity trashed, and any symbols of their work such as statues or public names and inscriptions, torn down and thrown out. In fact, there's an example of this going on as we speak today by Henry Reynolds' daughter, who is the Lord Mayor of Hobart, and who has successfully persuaded the council and the state of Tasmania to remove the statue of Dr. Crowther, who's one of the state's most generous public benefactors, philanthropists, from its position in Hobart. Reynolds himself, Henry, reserves his lengthiest and most bitter condemnation for Samuel Griffith. He focuses on Griffith's role in Queensland politics in the 20 years before he moved into the judiciary. Griffith was colonial, I mean, most of you will know this, but let me just say, Griffith was colonial Attorney General from 1874 to 1878, and he was Premier from 1883 to 1888, and again from 1890 to 1893. And this was the time, Reynolds says, when white settlers drove their sheep and cattle into the far corners of Queensland. He describes the period as one of, I'm quoting, perpetual conflict with Aboriginal bands defending their homelands. Unquote. Thousands of Aboriginal men and women and children were supposedly killed, but according to Reynolds, Griffith approved it all. And I'll quote him again, Griffith knew exactly what was happening out there in the vast hinterland. He did little to stop the killing. In Griffith's years in Parliament, Reynolds claims, there were numerous monthly patrols by Queensland's native police. Now the Queensland Native Police was a heavily armed force who, according to Reynolds, whose official instructions were purportedly to disperse large gatherings of Aboriginal people by shooting them. And I'll quote Reynolds again, Griffith sat in and presided over cabinet meetings during his 12 years in office. Along with his ministerial colleagues, he was not only complicit in the killings, he was personally responsible for it. That is the inescapable fact about cabinet responsibility in the system of government inherited from the British, unquote. Reynolds acknowledges that Griffith had few contacts himself with Aboriginal people, and he rarely travelled into the Queensland hinterland and had little to do with the native police themselves. but Reynolds says, and I'll quote him again, that's all beside the point. Griffith's ability in and great grasp of the law, praised in numerous accounts of his career, makes him especially culpable, unquote. Reynolds claims that many Queenslanders at the time believed it was both morally and legally permissible to kill Aboriginal people who resisted the spread of white settlement. He accuses Griffith himself of harbouring similar thoughts, even though as a man trained and steeped in the common law and the drafter of the Queensland Criminal Code, Griffith should have recognised that the Aboriginal people had long had the status of British subjects. And then Reynolds writes, and this is the point that I started with, and I'm quoting him, during his time in office, that's Griffith, there were hundreds of extrajudicial killings. About this, there can be no doubt. He was ultimately responsible for it and therefore guilty of what, after 1945, came to be known as crimes against humanity, unquote. According to Reynolds, John Downer purportedly did the same when he was Attorney General and Premier of South Australia between 1881 and 1893, when the colony also governed what is now called the Northern Territory. Reynolds says Downer was guilty of deliberately defying the law by ignoring Aboriginal rights in every one of the pastoral leases he approved for Northern Australia in the Gulf country. Had Downer upheld the law, he says, things might have been quite different, and dozens of alleged massacres of Aborigines in the Northern Territory in the 1880s would not have occurred. Now, Griffith and Downer were both important figures in the writing of the Constitution that created the nation of Australia in 1901, which is why Henry picks on them, because this is his bigger target. It was largely the draft constitution written by Griffith for the first Constitutional Convention in 1891, which was revised, amended and updated by the conventions of 1897 and 1898, that was eventually put to popular vote in the colonies and accepted. And Downer was one of the three-man drafting committee that, after the latter conventions, amended the bill for an Australian constitution and prescribed the objectives of the original Commonwealth Franchise Bill of 1902. In other words, if anyone were to write a history to identify Australia's founding fathers, these two gentlemen would certainly be on the shortlist. And this is why they figure as the principal targets of Reynolds' polemic. Now, Reynolds has spent most of his working life as an academic at James Cook University in Townsville, an institution that has a lot to be responsible for. When Reynolds discusses what action should be taken by his envisioned Commission for Truth-Telling, most of his recommendations are directed at the Queenslander, Samuel Griffith. And I'll quote Reynolds again: "Should anything be done about Griffith, or should we discreetly avert our eyes from the blood on the great man's hand? The answer we come up with will be a key indicator of whether truth-telling will bring about change," unquote. Now, Reynolds provides a list of actions he wants us to take. For a start, he wants the Brisbane electorate of Griffith to be renamed. He points out that the Australian Electoral Commission has already done this to other electorates such as Batman and Macmillan, and I can tell you that in unpublished document I've shown that Batman did kill some Aborigines lawfully but morally out of kilter, but Macmillan, there are the rumours about Macmillan which are completely untrue as far as I can see. But anyway, they have namesakes were accused of killing Aboriginal people. Reynolds also wants Griffith University to be renamed. He says precedents have been provided by prestigious universities in the United States who have removed names of colleges commemorating men with connections to the slave trade, including Woodrow Wilson. Now, Reynolds, you can see this happening. Reynolds urges Brisbane students to organise a mock trial to prosecute Griffith for crimes against humanity, while academics in the university's School of Criminology should publicly interrogate his legal career. Reynolds is confident that these kinds of symbolic changes will happen once truth-telling is installed after the referendum for the voice. But his underlying ambition is not confined to the names of electorates or universities. They are symbols of his much bigger project to change the way that Australians think about themselves and the society they inhabit. He wants Australians to feel just as ashamed of their own heritage as the Americans of the Deep South now feel about the way their forebears tolerated the lynching of blacks after the American Civil War. And again, this is not something he dreamt up and quickly. I'll quote you what he says in his book. A close and contemporaneous American parallel with the frontier killings in Queensland was the widespread practice of lynching, which reached its most intense phase in the US South in the 1890s. It was clearly a matter of extrajudicial killing that was widely approved in the American southern states, quite regardless of the formal legal situation. As in Queensland, the law was just ignored, unquote. In other words, the truth-telling project that we're promised as part of the unfinished business, if the referendum is successful, is far from being a matter of simply being gracious towards our continent's first inhabitants, as our Prime Minister wants us to believe. Nor is it a matter of changing a few names here and there and replacing a handful of historical symbols, such as naming rights and statues and the like. It is a program to destroy the reputation of Australia's real founding fathers and that of the nation they created in 1901. Its author's aim is not just to overturn the accepted national narrative, but to undermine the Australian culture, values and laws that have made us who we are. So, should anyone believe what Reynolds is saying? How much credibility is there in his assault on Samuel Griffith and his interpretation of what happened in Australia between 1788 and 1928? Well, in the book that made him famous when published by Penguin Books in 1981, a book called The Other Side of the Frontier, Reynolds at that stage claimed that there were 20,000 Aborigines had been killed in frontier warfare in the whole of Australia. Of these, he said, 8,000 to 10,000 were killed in Queensland, largely by the colony's native police. Now, I've written about this a long time ago, and I'm repeating stuff, but bear with me. The only source that Reynolds quotes footnoted to these figures was an essay of his own titled The Unrecorded Battlefields of Queensland. Oh yeah, it gets worse. It was published in a little red anthology he edited himself. And when I found it, I was surprised to see it was not a record of how many blacks had been killed, but of how many whites had been killed by blacks in Queensland in the 19th century. And now Reynolds counted white deaths at between 800 and 850. And there was no reference of number of black killings except in a footnote, the last footnote at the very end of the book. And he wrote, Aboriginal fear and insecurity was, we must assume, infinitely greater than that of the settlers. Their death rate may have been 10 times more than that of the Europeans. May have been. That's the sole evidence he offered for his claim that a total of 10,000 Aboriginal deaths in Queensland. He had 800 to 850, wasn't even sure of the number of whites who were killed. He multiplied that by 10 and then plucked another 1,500 out of the air to make it a nice round figure of 10,000. Now, one of the things about the left you can always rely on is that they like to brag about their successes. And in 2017, Reynolds' colleague at James Cook University, Noel Luce, gave his own and Henry's game away when he published a book on his own version on the Frontier Wars. And the title is it's not a funny thing. The title of his book was In the Shadow of Holocausts, Australia and the Third Reich. This is what they are being taught, not just in Townsville, but in everywhere that there are curriculums drawn up about Australian history these days. Now, Luce discussed, in this book, Australia and the Third Reich, Luce discussed the origins of Reynolds' initial figure of 10,000 in Queensland. In the early 1970s, he and Reynolds were writing a joint study of the number of whites and Chinese settlers killed by Aborigines in Queensland between 1861 and 1897. And I'll just read you Luce's own recollection of what happened. Quote, "How many Aborigines were killed in the process of resistance to the invaders?" Reynolds asked me. I assured him it was impossible to give an accurate estimate, but a conservative best guess would be at least 10 times the number of colonists and their employees killed in frontier resistance. I had been tempted, this is Luce saying, I had been tempted to say at least 20 times the number of colonists and their employees killed, but timidly opted for the lower number. Reynolds accepted my estimate as also applicable to southern Queensland. And so a best guess, this is Luce himself calling, and so a best guess becomes history. And he's put history in inverted commas to mean it's a postmodern idea about history. It's not real, it's what we say should be believed by people. So that's how they do history at James Cook University in Townsville. They make it up between themselves. However, in left-wing academic circles, this fictional figure was quickly welcomed. It helped awaken the potential of Aboriginal history to tell a story of terrible oppression by the white ruling class to give Australian politics a new category of victims. Reynolds' figure was soon defended by a growing pool of lecturers and students as authoritative. And this was despite the fact that Reynolds himself admitted there was a problem with getting evidence to prove his claim. He said the greatest killers of Aborigines were the government's own creation, the Queensland Native Police. However, the official records of the Native Police and what they did on their patrols was not available. The records had been destroyed, sent to the incinerators, he said, in the 1930s. So no one now can provide an accurate count of the death toll. And other Queensland historians who followed Reynolds agreed. But some of them took a dim view of the methods that Luce and Henry had adopted. In fact, one of them, who still leans strongly to the left, Jonathan Richards, in his 2008 book, The Secret War, The True History of Queensland's Native Police, he warned readers, and I'm quoting him, "Since so few accurate records have survived, any enumeration on colonial violence are always incomplete. The calculation of frontier kill ratios risk becoming a perverted academic exercise serving no useful purpose," unquote. And that is pretty obviously the view that we should all apply to all of Henry Reynolds' guesswork about the number of people killed in Queensland. It's a perverted academic exercise. Moreover, as the time when Luce and Reynolds are writing, in Victoria, an exhaustive study of Native Police operations from 1837 to 1853 told a story completely the opposite of what Reynolds had claimed occurred in Queensland. And a very good historian who did all the right things, got a top-rated PhD, but never got an academic position, was Mari Fells. And the book that she wrote that sort of killed her prospective career in academia was titled Good Men and True. It was published in 1988 by the University of Melbourne and was closely based on the abundant records of Native Police operations she found for her region of Victoria. Fells concluded that the Native Police there were largely responsible for the relative absence of conflict in Victoria. They had been a deterrent force against both sides of the racial divide, preventing actions between blacks and whites, but particularly between blacks and blacks. And the low degree of trouble was the mark of their success. And so the conclusion we have from the books on this subject are that in Victoria, where the records survived, there was very little killing of Aborigines. But in Queensland, where the records were gone, the killings were rampant. Now, in Reynolds' latest foray into statistics, in truth-telling, he endorses an academic paper based on what he calls the meticulous research of Raymond Evans and Robert Orsted Jenkins of the University of Queensland. The paper was given at a conference of the Australian Historical Society and published in an academic journal in 2014. And it's the principal source that Reynolds now offers in truth-telling as a figure for the figure of more than 100,000 deaths in Australian frontier wars. Now, I don't have time to take you through the depths of the statistical cesspit that created by these authors, except to say that they accused the Queensland Native Police of going out on patrol every week for more than 40 years in the 19th century and killing an average of 12 Aborigines during every one of their patrols. There's no credible evidence for this figure at all, but they multiply it by another estimate that the total number of Native Police patrols in these 40 years was 3,420. Now that 3,420 patrols is pure invention. It's not 3,000, it's 3,420 to make it look as if they actually counted something, but they counted nothing. And then they multiplied that by the number of patrols, by the number of Aborigines supposedly killed. Of the Aborigines, they had a small statistical count, mainly drawn from reports in newspapers. what's his name? Evans statistical account said there were 2 Aborigines killed in some of the patrols. Orsted Jenkins found a couple of newspaper reports that said there were 12 Aborigines killed by the police in their patrols. So they said, we'll make the average number of Queensland deaths by patrols over 40 years, we'll make it 12 per patrol. We'll multiply it by 3,420, and they therefore got their figure of 41,000 Aborigines. In short, all this meticulous research that Henry Reynolds attributes to their efforts is nothing but another version of the kind of guesswork that Reynolds pioneered in 1981. The number of patrols is a guess, the number of killings per patrol is a guess, and so the total of 41,000 is simply the result of multiplying one guess by another guess. Moreover, they go on to add more guesswork about the number of Aborigines supposedly killed by white settlers, not the native police, but by white settlers, without the help of native police. And they add to their pile another 3,500 deaths, which they claim took place in the 1850s. Now, the result of all this statistical manipulation is a grand total of 665,000 Aborigines plus 1,500 whites killed in the frontier wars in colonial Queensland. And Reynolds himself, is, like the figures I'm quoting here are from Evans and Orsted Jenkins. Reynolds is only too happy to accept the new figure. In his book Truth Telling, he not only endorses it, but he adds his own guesstimate, another plucking from the air, that another 40,000 Aborigines were killed by whites in states other than Queensland. So this brings the total of frontier deaths up to 100,000. As he has confidently repeated ever since, most recently in a discussion he and Rachel Perkins had on the National Press Club, which the ABC broadcast in full, that figure eclipses the total number of Australian soldiers killed in all their overseas wars. Hence, the frontier wars become the biggest Australia has ever experienced. And if you see in the Uluru Statement of the Heart that there's so many arguments last week about whether it's one page or whether it's 18 pages or 26 pages, but this is the basis of their claim that we deserve constitutional recognition, truth-telling, treaty-making and sovereignty because of the terrible things that have been done to us in Australian history. This is you don't call it evidence because it's an insult to the word evidence, but this is the basis of what the Uluru Statement from the Heart believes in. And if you've seen Reynolds at the National Press Club or in a few ABC interviews apart from that, and SBS interviews apart from that, he does not feel obliged to give his figure of 100,000 dead as a statistical invention. He presents it to his audience as a finding that is incontrovertible. Some of his followers, like Rachel Perkins, also had publicised it as an absolute truth. In her, if anyone watched the SBS program, the series of programs, The Australian Wars, she says 100,000 is absolute truth. Everyone should believe it, and no questions asked. In the mentality of today's left-wing progressives, the frontier wars have become the most culturally significant definer of the Australian national character. They want the Anzacs who died in World War I to lose their position in the Australian narrative, and the largely imaginary Aboriginal warriors who supposedly perished on the frontier to take their place. Reynolds wants the Australian War Memorial to place alongside the tomb of the unknown soldier, a recent addition to the Australian War Memorial. He wants the unknown soldier killed in France in the trenches to have alongside it a coffin for the unknown Aboriginal warrior killed in the frontiers of Australia. And let me tell you that Kim Beazley has been appointed by the Albanese government as the head of the Australian War Memorial, and while Brendan Nelson, when he was in that position, would have no bar with Reynolds' case, Kim Beazley has so far, he hasn't rejected it. He said, we're going to do new things with the War Memorial, but they are yet to emerge. But it's no prizes for guessing what's going to happen. Reynolds says that the unknown warrior's body in the Australian War Memorial would be an event of immense national importance, a symbol of respect, inclusion and reconciliation, unquote. And also what they want, and you can see this becoming one of the early laws proposed by the voice in the Constitution, of all the many plaques, arches and obelisks in war memorials that almost every small country town, most suburbs in Australia have to honour our soldiers today, they would demand the similar recognition of Aborigines who supposedly died in frontier wars. And Reynolds and Rachel Perkins have said that those memorials that most people, you drive past and you see them standing there to have an Aboriginal content that everyone can see as well. There's been a denial by Megan Davis that they want to change Australia Day from January 26 to a holiday, and I actually believe her. They don't want to change it at all. They want to keep it, but they want to do what happened in Hobart in 2004, which was the 200th anniversary of the founding of the city of Hobart, when, if you remember, I can't remember his name, he was a Maoist from Victoria who was Premier at the time, Jim Bacon. Yeah, what they put on, they put on a funeral service, and everyone was dressed in black. It was all on television, and Henry was the star of the television show, and so they're going to keep this. They want to keep the Australia Day on January 26th, but have it as a day of sorrow, mourning, a day like the Anzac ceremony that we have had since World War I. In other words, they are directly targeting those themes, signs and symbols that have traditionally expressed what it means to be Australian. They want to redefine the psyche and the soul of the nation. And this is the real cultural issue at stake when Australians go to the polls to vote on the referendum for the voice. They will not be writing yes or no, but whether they are for or against a cultural revolution. In short, the Uluru truth-setting exercise is not based on truth at all. It is yet another example of contemporary academic fraud, told for political ends, but unfortunately, right now, they are on the brink of being successful. Thank you.
I think in view of time, we might have time for one question only, so make it a good one. Will Morgan.
Keith, just looking up where this research was paid for, I think it's the Australian Research Council or something. Could you, for this so-called truth, there's a lot of papers online about it and a lot of funding for it. Tell me about the funding of the untruths.
Look, I'm sorry, I don't know about that. All I know is that when Brendan Nelson was minister in the Howard government, I think, well, it was late 90s or early 2000s. Anyway, he had the courage to knock back a few of the more preposterous pieces of academic research that were being funded by the Australian Research Council, and I think did Mr. Tian do the same? He was Education Minister for a while. I'm not sure if he was the one who. But anyway, under the Morrison government, there was also rejections of some ARC papers, and there was a story in the paper just a few days ago, a couple of weeks ago, about one of the demands from the Voice is to stop the minister from having any say whatsoever into the quality of the work or the banning of a piece of work that he might think is ridiculous or offensive or what have you. So they want to have the funding for this kind of academic research entirely in their own hands, no matter whether the minister is Labor or Liberal, and that's under Albanese government. That's very likely to happen.
Well, would you join me all in thanking Keith Windschuttle for his paper?